This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and rituals are purely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. The depiction of internet fraud, scams, and rituals is for storytelling purposes only and does not encourage or condone illegal or harmful activities. Fraud, manipulation, and human sacrifice are illegal, immoral, and should never be attempted. The story aims to highlight the destructive consequences of such actions. It was supposed to be a quick and easy scam, but as Fundz LORD sat in his dimly lit room, staring at the computer screen, a sense of dread crept up his spine. The money was about to hit his account, and everything would change. He could almost feel the weight of the world crashing down on him as the countdown continued. Just then, the phone rang. It was the first warning. His mentor, Chijioke, a man as cold as the streetlights flickering outside, was on the line. "We got a problem." Chijioke's voice was calm, but there was an urgency to it that rattled Fundz LORD. But Fundz LORD was no stranger to problems. He had learned early in life that problems could be solved with the right connections, and he had the best ones. With a steady hand, Fundz LORD clicked send on the email, sealing the deal. His life had just taken another irreversible step into the abyss. Benin City, the capital of Edo State, was a city of contrasts. Its streets were bustling with life, vibrant with the hustle of local businesses, and yet, beneath the surface, a darker world thrived. Fundz LORD knew the city better than most. He had seen the poverty, the desperation, the dreams of those who longed for something bigger than the small confines of their lives. Born into a family that had nothing, Fundz LORD's story was one of survival. As a boy, he'd been fed the same stories everyone in his neighborhood had heard. If you want something, you have to take it. But Fundz LORD wasn't like the others. He didn't want to be a petty thief. He didn't want to scrape by with menial jobs. He wanted power, respect, money, the kind of money that would change everything. He'd watched as the so-called big boys rolled into town, dripping in gold chains and designer clothes, stepping out of flashy cars, laughing with women who couldn't seem to get enough of them. It wasn't just their wealth that attracted him. It was the fear they commanded, the power they had to shape lives with a single decision. Fundz LORD had learned early that these men weren't like others. They were part of something bigger, a network, a world where crime wasn't just a way of life, it was a way to climb the ladder. And as Fundz LORD sat in his room, typing out the final details of yet another scam, he realized that he was just one step away from becoming one of them. He had made the choice. No turning back now. It had all started when Fundz LORD had met Chijioke. Chijioke was a mentor of sorts, one of the original Yahoo boys who had seen it all. He had risen through the ranks, using his connections to build a sprawling operation that spanned continents. Fundz LORD had first been introduced to Chijioke at a local nightclub, a place where the rich and the powerful in Benin City often gathered. You want to make real money, you need the right people, the right partners, Chijioke had told him, his eyes glinting with a mix of ambition and secrecy. Chijioke had introduced Fundz LORD to the key players in the game, Nigerians who had set up operations in the United States, managing to convince the FBI to look the other way as they funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into foreign accounts. These men had been running scams for years, but what made them different was their ability to hide their tracks. "We get the information, we attack when they're most vulnerable," one of the U.S. partners had explained over encrypted calls. "They'll never know what hit them. We make the money, and we disappear before they even realize they've been scammed." Fundz LORD quickly became involved in this underground operation, with his partners providing him with all the necessary tools. They would find victims in the United States, vulnerable individuals who would fall for fraudulent romance scams or lottery winnings. The victims would send large sums of money, unaware that it would disappear into foreign bank accounts in the blink of an eye. But there was one thing Fundz LORD hadn't counted on: the rituals. It wasn't enough for him to just be good at what he did. He had to prove himself. And in the world of internet fraud, proving yourself wasn't just about how smart you were. It was about making sure you were protected. The first ritual had been simple enough. Chijioke had taken him to a local spiritual leader, a Baba, who promised to give him good luck and protection in exchange for a sacrifice. At first, Fundz LORD had been skeptical, dismissing it as superstition. But after his first successful scam, which had netted him a small fortune, he began to believe. The Baba had told him, "Wealth comes at a price. You will need to give in order to receive." The words echoed in Fundz LORD's mind as he remembered his first ritual. The sacrifice had been a simple goat, but the significance had been clear. It was the beginning of his commitment to the spiritual side of his operations. It wasn't long before the rituals grew darker. To ensure greater success, Fundz LORD was told he had to give more. The first human sacrifice came as a shock. His girlfriend, Amara, had no idea that she was about to become the price of his success. Fundz LORD knew it wasn't right, but his desire for more power drowned out the voices of doubt. She was the first, but she wouldn't be the last. Success came quickly. Fundz LORD bought a sleek black Mercedes-Benz, then a house in a gated neighborhood. His parties became legendary, with women eager to flock to him, attracted by the power and wealth he displayed. But with each passing day, the weight of his actions grew heavier. As the money came in, so did the problems. His relationships became strained, his family, friends, and loved ones started asking questions. They could see the change in him, the darkness that began to seep into his soul. But Fundz LORD couldn't stop. He was on a path and there was no turning back. But even as he enjoyed the fruits of his labor, something gnawed at him. The sacrifices, the rituals, the people he had betrayed along the way. He couldn't ignore the feeling that it would all come crashing down soon. But for now, he held on to the thrill of his power. The sun had barely risen over Benin City when Fundz LORD received the call. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of his U.S. partners, Caleb, a tech-savvy hustler who ran a large operation from New York. Their partnership was what kept Fundz LORD at the top of his game, enabling him to siphon money from vulnerable individuals across the globe. The message was short, but its impact was immediate. Big target today. Bank account set up. Waiting for the victims to bite. You ready? Fundz LORD ran his fingers over his face, wiping the remnants of sleep from his eyes. He had been up late the night before, transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars from one account to another. His mind buzzed with the same relentless energy that had driven him since his first scam. The thrill of the hunt, the rush of success. It was addictive. He quickly tapped in his response. All set. Let's roll. The partnership with Caleb and his team had begun months ago. Fundz LORD had been introduced to Caleb through Chijiok, who assured him that Caleb was one of the best in the business. Caleb's operation in the United States was vast. He and his crew had a network of fake accounts set up to launder stolen money, with links in Canada, the UK, and even parts of Europe. We don't just rely on scam tactics, Caleb had explained to Fundz LORD over a secure call. We've got the tech. We've got the banks. We've got the people. You keep bringing the victims, we'll keep the money flowing. At first, Fundz LORD had been skeptical, but after seeing the money roll in, he was convinced. Caleb had helped him establish access to foreign accounts, primarily in the US, where the banking system was far less scrutinized compared to Nigeria. The more Fundz LORD learned about Caleb's operation, the deeper he got into the world of international fraud. They would scour online platforms for vulnerable individuals, those who had been scammed before and didn't report it, or older women looking for companionship. The team would craft fake profiles, posing as rich, successful men or women who were looking for a soulmate. When the victims fell for the bait, they would be guided to wire large sums of money for travel expenses or emergency fees. Every time, the money disappeared without a trace. But it wasn't just about scamming for Fundz LORD. The thrill of control, the manipulation of people's emotions, was what excited him. Each successful scam made him feel invincible. As Fundz LORD's involvement in the fraud network deepened, so too did his reliance on rituals to protect his operation. The first ritual had been an introduction to the power that the spiritual leaders could give him. Now, Fundz LORD was beginning to see that the world of voodoo wasn't just about luck, it was about power. And power was what he craved. One evening, as the moon hung high in the sky, Fundz LORD visited a witch doctor known as OSA, deep in the heart of Benin City. The Baba was an old man, covered in traditional markings, and his eyes held the weight of centuries of secrets. OSA's eyes glinted with recognition when Fundz LORD stepped into his hut. "You've come to pay the price, eh? You want more than wealth. You want protection, dominance." Fundz LORD nodded, his mind already made up. He had crossed the line too many times to stop now. The whispers of power were too alluring. "You've already taken the first step," OSA said as he looked into Fundz LORD's eyes. "Now you must make the sacrifice." This time, the price would be higher. OSA had spoken of a blood sacrifice, someone close to Fundz LORD who could give him the protection he needed. But Fundz LORD wasn't sure he could do it. Not again. Not after Amara. Amara had been the first, the woman he once loved. But he had sacrificed her for his wealth. And it had worked. Now Fundz LORD stood at a crossroads. He had to decide who would be next. His thoughts drifted to his mother, a loving woman who had always been there for him. She had sacrificed everything to give him a better life. Was it worth it? But the power he sought was too great. The ritual had to be completed. He couldn't afford to lose everything now. The desire for more wealth, more respect, was stronger than his conscience. "I'll make the sacrifice," Fundz LORD said, his voice low. "Tell me what I need to do." As the days passed, Fundz LORD became more immersed in his work. The money flowed in, and the lifestyle he had dreamed of became a reality. He bought more cars, moved into a better house, and started attending even more lavish parties. But as his power grew, so did the pressure. Chijioke called regularly, reminding him that the stakes were higher than ever. "You need to keep your head low," Chijioke advised. "Things are getting hot. The feds are getting smarter." But Fundz LORD didn't care. He had made it this far. Nothing would stop him now. One day, as he sat in his luxurious new apartment, watching the sunset from his balcony, he received another call from Caleb. The message was simple: "It's happening tonight. Get ready." The target was a woman from California. She was older, widowed, and had recently received a large inheritance. She had fallen for the scam, hook, line, and sinker. The money was coming, and Fundz LORD had to make sure everything went smoothly. The more Fundz LORD sank into this world, the more detached he became from reality. He no longer saw the faces of the victims. The people whose lives he destroyed were nothing more than numbers on a bank statement. He felt untouchable. After all, he was sitting in a penthouse, protected by the network of criminals he had built. But deep down, he knew that sooner or later, everything would come crashing down. He had made too many enemies, broken too many rules. The rituals had started to lose their meaning, and the protection he once believed they gave him began to feel hollow. As the night wore on and the money flowed, Fundz LORD couldn't shake the feeling that his time was running out. The high-rise apartments of Benin City's wealthiest district sparkled under the night sky, their lights reflecting off the streets below. Fundz LORD leaned back in his leather chair, the distant hum of nightlife mingling with the buzz in his mind. This was the life he'd always wanted, the life he'd fought for. Yet, for all the glimmering surfaces, a darkness lingered beneath the opulence. He was sitting in his newest acquisition, a penthouse that overlooked the city. The spacious living room was decked out with every luxury: plush white leather sofas, gold-trimmed mirrors, and crystal chandeliers. On the coffee table, a few empty bottles of expensive whiskey and champagne lay discarded, the aftermath of an impromptu celebration the night before. As Fundz LORD swirled a glass of cognac in his hand, he gazed out the window at the twinkling lights below. He had come a long way from the struggling young man who had once walked these streets with nothing but dreams. Now he was untouchable, or so he thought. His phone buzzed again. It was Chijioke. "Money's moving, but you need to be careful. The heat's on. The feds are getting close." Chijioke's voice crackled through the speaker. Fundz LORD nodded absently, barely paying attention. He'd heard it all before. "They're just rumors," he replied, trying to sound confident. But deep down, a seed of doubt began to take root. Chijioke continued, undeterred. "This thing is bigger than you think, Fundz. We're talking millions. You're too visible now. Keep low. They'll find you eventually if you keep playing this game. Fundz LORD sighed, looking around the room. His world had been built on risk, on the edge of what was legal, what was moral. He thrived in the thrill of deception, of outsmarting the system. I'm fine, Chijiok. Just keep me updated on the US side. I'll handle things here. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair again. The weight of his success felt heavier now, like a crown made of thorns. The lavish lifestyle was everything he had ever wanted. Women adored him. He'd had a few short-lived relationships, none too serious, but each one was a reminder of his newfound power. He could have anyone, buy anything, and control everything. The image of success was there. Luxury cars, private jets, and designer clothes. But as the nights grew longer, he began to feel an emptiness. A sense that the people around him were only drawn to the wealth, not to him. Tonight, he was throwing another party. A celebration, a way to maintain his status among the elites of Benin City. Guests arrived in their finest clothes, stepping out of black SUVs and sports cars, their faces masked with smiles and laughter. They were all here for one reason, to bask in his success. Fundz LORD, you're the man. This place is incredible. One of his old friends, Tund, called out as he entered. Tund was one of the first people Fundz LORD had known when he started his hustle. Now, he was a constant presence at Fundz LORD's parties, his face always full of praise. But Fundz LORD could see through it. Tund wasn't really a friend. He was just another hanger-on. Thanks, man. It's good to see you, Fundz LORD replied, offering a forced smile as he made his way to the bar. He poured himself another drink, trying to drown out the voice that whispered inside him. This wasn't real. None of it was. The guests milled about, laughing, dancing, their laughter echoing in the high-ceilinged room. The women flitted around, draped in expensive gowns, their eyes occasionally glancing at Fundz LORD, who was the center of attention. But despite the applause, despite the cheers, Fundz LORD felt disconnected from it all. The empty conversations, the shallow compliments, they didn't fill the void inside him. He saw Amara in the crowd, her face, soft and gentle, as she danced with another man. She looked carefree, as if she didn't know about the ritual, about the price he had paid. He could see her in his peripheral vision, her laughter bouncing off the walls. The guilt stabbed him, deeper than any punishment he could ever face. But guilt was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had chosen this life, and now there was no turning back. Fundz LORD retreated to the balcony, away from the noise. The cool night air filled his lungs, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth inside. The city sprawled beneath him. He had it all, yet he felt like he had nothing. The memory of Osa's words haunted him. You want power, you pay the price. You want protection, you sacrifice. His hands gripped the railing. The wind brushed past him as he tried to push the thoughts away. He could hear the laughter from the party echoing through the walls, but it was as if it came from a distant world. This wasn't the life he had imagined. The power, the success, had come at a cost he hadn't fully understood. It had turned his heart to stone. Back inside, the party raged on. Fundz LORD was pulled back into the crowd, his presence now a symbol of his dominance. He felt a brief moment of relief as the alcohol began to numb the unease in his chest. Women approached him, eager for attention, for the luxury he offered. One of them, a woman with piercing green eyes and a body draped in gold, slid up to him and whispered something in his ear. "You're a god in this city, Fundz LORD," she said, her voice sultry and sweet. But Fundz LORD's mind drifted. The voices of his U.S. partners, the money, the women, they were all part of the same illusion. The world was closing in on him, and no matter how much wealth he amassed, he couldn't shake the emptiness inside. As the night wore on, Fundz LORD watched the woman who had once been the love of his life, the one he had sacrificed to the gods, dance with another man, her smile lighting up the room. He knew what he had done to her, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Not yet. The night after the party, Fundz LORD woke up with a hangover. His head pounded as the sunlight filtered through the thick curtains, casting long shadows across his luxurious penthouse. It was one of those mornings when the weight of his actions felt particularly heavy. The laughter, the music, the compliments. It all felt so shallow now. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed, seemed meaningless in the cold light of day. But there was no time for reflection. He had work to do. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Caleb, the connection he had in the US. The message was brief, but it hit him hard. Target confirmed. Victim on the hook. She's vulnerable. Ready to move. Fundz LORD stared at the message for a moment, his fingers drumming impatiently on the table. Another victim. Another life to ruin. This was the game he was in now, and there was no escaping it. It wasn't just about taking money anymore. The thrill of scamming people had evolved into something much more dangerous. Fundz LORD had learned how to exploit human emotion, how to manipulate people from thousands of miles away. He was no longer just a scammer. He was a puppeteer, controlling the strings of unsuspecting victims across the globe. His US partners had created fake profiles on dating websites, convincing lonely women to believe they were in a real relationship. Each scam was carefully orchestrated, sensitive photos sent, heartfelt messages exchanged, trust slowly built. And then, when the victim was most vulnerable, the emergency would occur. The lover would suddenly need money for travel expenses, for hospital bills, or for a business venture. The money, large sums of it, would be wired to foreign accounts. Money Fundz LORD would clean and use for his growing empire. This time, it was a woman named Claire, a widow living in the Midwest. She had recently inherited a large sum of money from her late husband's life insurance, and Fundz LORD had set his sights on her. His partner Caleb had done the groundwork. He'd initiated contact with Claire, carefully crafting the persona of an affluent businessman in need of a personal loan. The online connection between her and Daniel Rivers, the man Fundz LORD had become, was built over weeks. Each conversation was calculated, designed to make her trust him completely. Now, Fundz LORD was ready to finalize the deal. The hardest part of the scam was convincing the victims to part with their money. It wasn't enough to just send a request for funds. No, Fundz LORD had learned the key to a successful scam was emotional manipulation. The more a person cared about the fraudster, the easier it was to break down their defenses. He sat in his penthouse, his fingers poised over the keyboard, composing a message for Claire. It had to be perfect, heartfelt, sincere, and believable. Claire, I need you now more than ever. I've been in a terrible accident, and the doctors here say I need immediate surgery. If I don't get the money, I won't make it. You've been my rock, and I need you to help me. Please, don't let me down. It was a message filled with just enough desperation. A cry for help from a man she had never met but had come to believe in. Fundz LORD hit send and leaned back, his eyes scanning the bank statements in front of him. As the money rolled in, he couldn't help but feel a small, fleeting sense of triumph. Yet, beneath it all, something gnawed at him. Something that had always been there, the knowledge that every dollar he earned came at someone else's expense. While Fundz LORD basked in his success, the victims of his scams were left in ruins. Claire's case was no different. Over the next few days, Fundz LORD monitored her responses carefully. She was desperate, sending money to an account that didn't even exist in the name she knew. The transfer amounts grew, and Fundz LORD knew he had her. She would send everything she had if it meant saving Daniel. Her emotions had been completely manipulated. What Fundz LORD had failed to recognize, however, was how much damage he was causing. Claire's children, oblivious to the online romance their mother had become obsessed with, began to notice the changes. The money that had once been reserved for their education and the upkeep of the house was now being sent to Fundz LORD's account. Claire had sold possessions, borrowed from family, and drained her savings, all for a man who didn't even exist. But Fundz LORD didn't care. He had more than enough to cover his luxury lifestyle. He had more than he could ever need. And yet, the thought of Claire and her suffering stayed with him for days, though he pushed it away each time it surfaced. It was the cost of doing business. He wasn't in this for the guilt, and he couldn't afford to let it interfere with his work. On the other side of the world, Claire's life fell apart. She had no idea that the man she had been in love with was a fiction. She had been targeted for her vulnerability and had been strung along until it was too late. One morning, her son found her sitting in front of the computer, her hands trembling as she tried to send another payment. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken. She had withdrawn from her social circles, refused to talk to her family, and spent every waking moment corresponding with the man she thought loved her. "Mom, stop. He's not real. Please, you have to listen," her son pleaded, but it was too late. Fundz LORD glanced at the latest message from Caleb. Another victim had been successfully drained of her money, but unlike his earlier successes, Fundz LORD wasn't celebrating. Something inside him stirred, something uncomfortable. For a brief moment, he wondered if he was any different from the people he had once looked down on. The world he had built, so carefully crafted, now seemed empty. His success, his wealth, his power, none of it filled the emptiness inside. As Claire's last message arrived, pleading for his help, Fundz LORD stared at the screen, his fingers poised over the keyboard. For the first time, he didn't know what to write. "I'm sorry," he typed, then erased it. He couldn't afford to feel sorry. Not now. Not when the money was still coming in. But deep down, a voice told him it wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the weight of his actions would come crashing down. The sun was low in the sky as Fundz LORD sat on his balcony, staring at the sprawling view of Benin City. His penthouse overlooked the ever-moving streets, the chaos of everyday life blending into the horizon. His wealth, his empire, seemed so far removed from the reality of the people below. But the more he sat in this golden cage, the more he realized that something had shifted inside him, something that wouldn't go away. It had been a few days since the last scam was completed, the money flowing in as usual. But instead of celebrating, Fundz LORD found himself pacing the length of his apartment, unable to shake the guilt that kept creeping into his thoughts. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the people whose lives he had ruined, like Claire. She wasn't just some faceless victim to him anymore. He could hear her voice in his head, the pleading tone as she begged him to help her, to stop the nightmare he had put her through. But he couldn't stop. He had come too far. There was no turning back now. As the days passed, the weight of his decisions began to press on him like a heavy stone in his chest. He was used to the parties, the women, and the material wealth. He had surrounded himself with the luxuries of life, but the emptiness remained. It gnawed at him like a hunger that no amount of money could satisfy. One night, as he lay awake in bed, his thoughts turned to Amara. He hadn't thought of her in a while, at least not in the way that mattered. She was the first sacrifice, the one who had given him the protection he thought he needed. She had been so trusting, so loving, and yet he had discarded her as easily as if she were nothing more than a stepping stone. Amara had been everything to him once. They had dreams together, plans to escape the grind of their lives. But when the money started rolling in, the plans changed. She had to go, and so he sacrificed her. But now, as he lay in the dark, the consequences of that choice seemed so clear. The success, the power, the wealth, it all came with a cost. And the cost had been her. Amara's face appeared in his mind's eye, clear as day. The way she had looked at him before he made the decision to go through with the ritual. The look in her eyes had been filled with love and trust. Trust that he had betrayed. It had been a quiet, private moment between them, just before he had made the final choice. Her smile had been the same, but there had been an edge to it, something he hadn't noticed at the time. "I believe in you, Fundz," she had whispered softly, touching his cheek. "You'll be the one to change everything for us. I know it." But that had been before he had made the decision to let her go. The memory of that moment twisted in his gut. If only he could go back. If only he could have kept her safe. But that wasn't an option anymore. He had crossed a line, and the rituals had claimed her in exchange for his rise. The next morning, Fundz LORD sat at his desk, staring at the bank accounts in front of him. The numbers had never been more satisfying. But as he reviewed the list of victims and the money that flowed into his accounts, the satisfaction felt hollow. He glanced at the calendar on his phone, noting the upcoming deadline for the next big scam. Another woman had been targeted. This time, her story was different. She had recently lost her job, a struggling single mother in need of help. It was a perfect opportunity for Fundz LORD's operation to move in and exploit her vulnerability. The plan was simple: gain her trust, extract the money, and disappear. But as Fundz LORD picked up his phone to send the confirmation to Caleb, something stopped him. A brief hesitation in his hand, a lingering thought in the back of his mind. What had happened to him? When had it all started feeling wrong? He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, the cursor blinking in front of him. The path had been set, but now he wasn't sure he could continue. Just then, Fundz LORD's phone rang. It was Chijiok. His voice, as cold as ever, crackled through the line. Fundz LORD, what's going on with you? You've been distant. We've got work to do. Don't start getting soft on me. Fundz LORD stiffened. He didn't want to explain his doubts. He didn't want to admit to Chijiok that the weight of everything was starting to crush him. I'm fine, Fundz LORD lied, his voice steady. Just dealing with some stuff. I'm on it. Good, Chijiok replied, his voice sharp. Don't lose focus. You're in too deep to back out now. We've got bigger plans coming. Don't mess this up. Fundz LORD nodded even though Chijiok couldn't see him. I won't. But as the call ended, the unease didn't leave him. The life he had built was coming apart, piece by piece. Every scam he ran, every ritual he performed, was pushing him further into darkness. But the thought of backing out, of walking away from everything he had achieved, was even more terrifying. He had created this world for himself. He had sacrificed too much to let it go now. That night, Fundz LORD received an unexpected visit. It was Amara. She stood at his door, her presence as haunting as it was unexpected. Her eyes were tired, and her face was drawn, but she still held herself with that quiet dignity he remembered. I didn't think I'd ever see you again, Fundz LORD said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Amara's gaze softened, but there was something in her eyes. A sadness, a knowing look. I had to come back, Fundz. I couldn't just disappear without seeing you one last time. He stepped back, unsure of what to say. The guilt that had been festering inside him threatened to explode. Why? He asked, his voice cracking. Why did you come back? After everything? Amara smiled softly, a sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Because, Fundz, no matter what you've done, I still care about you. I can't hate you for what you've become. But there was more in her voice than just that. There was the sound of someone who had moved on, someone who had finally let go. And that realization hit Fundz LORD harder than anything else. The next few days passed in a blur. Fundz LORD went through the motions, meeting with his partners, pulling off small scams, laundering the money through various accounts, and living the life that most people only dream of. But none of it mattered anymore. He had everything he could ever want. Luxury cars, clothes, and a penthouse in one of the most exclusive parts of Benin City. But something inside him felt empty. That night, as he sat alone in his office, staring at the screen, the weight of his choices seemed to crush him from all sides. The thrill of the hustle was gone. The guilt that had gnawed at him in moments of quiet introspection was now an unbearable ache. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Caleb. We've got a big one coming in. This is the one, Fundz. It's gonna change everything. Caleb's voice crackled through the phone. Fundz LORD sat up straighter, trying to mask the weariness in his voice. What's the deal? Caleb was excited, almost manic. We've targeted a huge corporate investor. The type of guy who's loaded but too proud to let anyone in on his secrets. He's set to make a huge transfer to his overseas account. If we intercept it, we're talking millions, Fundz. Millions. Fundz LORD felt a surge of adrenaline, a brief flicker of the old thrill. This was what he had been waiting for, the ultimate score. The scam to end all scams. But even as the excitement surged through him, the old doubts lingered. This was bigger than anything they'd ever done before. It wasn't just about a few $1,000s or a quick scam. It was about a fortune. And once it was over, where would he go? What would be left? The plan was simple, too simple. The investor, a high-profile businessman based in the US, had been lured into a fake investment scheme. They had created a perfect illusion, convincing him that a new startup was looking for an angel investor. The setup was flawless. The businessman was already interested, but he was too cautious to jump in immediately. So, they worked their magic, building trust slowly over weeks, until he was ready to invest a large sum. The next step was even more straightforward. Intercept the transaction. With the help of his partners in the US, Fundz LORD's team had set up a shell company to receive the transfer. They would reroute the money into an account that Fundz LORD controlled, effectively stealing the investment without ever being detected. It was the perfect scam. With the plan in motion, Fundz LORD could feel the pressure mounting. This was the big one. If everything went smoothly, he could retire early, live the life he had always dreamed of. No more scams, no more rituals, no more dealing with people he didn't trust. But deep down, he knew that once the money came in, there would be no turning back. He had already crossed so many lines, but this felt like the final one. The need to protect his empire, his success, was overwhelming. He couldn't let anyone stand in his way, not even the people he cared about. His mind drifted back to the ritual, to the sacrifices that had paved the way for his rise. He had already sacrificed Amara. She was gone, and there was no bringing her back. But what about his mother? Could he continue down this path without further sacrifices? The old Baba's words echoed in his mind. You want protection, you make the sacrifice. There's always a price. He pushed the thoughts aside. He had more important things to focus on. It was nearly midnight when Caleb called again. The deal was about to be finalized. It's time, Fundz, Caleb said, his voice tight with anticipation. The transfer is coming through. Make sure everything is in place. Fundz LORD took a deep breath. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now it was finally happening. He was about to pull off the biggest scam of his career. The money began to move. He watched the account balance grow, the numbers ticking higher and higher until the full amount was transferred. Millions of dollars flowing into his account. It was more money than he had ever imagined. More than enough to live like a king for the rest of his life. The feeling of power was intoxicating. The life he had built, the empire he had created, was finally complete. And yet, something inside him shifted. He had won, but at what cost? As the money settled into his account, Fundz LORD felt a cold chill creep over him. The excitement, the thrill, the rush of success. All of it faded away, replaced by a sense of dread. This wasn't the end. Couldn't be. He turned off his computer and stood up, walking to the window. He could hear the distant hum of the city below, the life of Benin City moving on as usual. But for Fundz LORD, everything had changed. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Chijioke. It's done. But keep your eyes open. The feds are onto us. You've got to lay low for a while. Fundz LORD ran his fingers through his hair. The excitement of the scam had barely registered before reality hit him. The feds were closing in. The money was in his account, but the danger was closer than ever. He had everything he ever wanted, but at what cost? And now there was no escaping the consequences. As the night wore on, Fundz LORD sat in silence, staring at the city below. The money, the power, the success, it was all his. But deep down, he knew that it wouldn't last forever. The FBI was closing in, and there was no way to stop it. His empire was crumbling before his eyes. And then there was the other choice, the choice he had been avoiding. The path of redemption, of walking away from it all. But that would mean abandoning everything he had worked for. And worst of all, it would mean confronting the man he had become. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Caleb, this time with a more urgent tone. Fundz, the authorities are coming for us. We need to move fast. Get your things together. This is bigger than we thought. Fundz LORD stood up, his heart racing. He had no time to think. The choice had been made for him. He was in too deep to back out now. But somewhere deep inside, A small part of him knew that this would be the beginning of the end. The days following the transfer were a whirlwind of activity. Fundz LORD tried to ignore the feeling of impending doom, focusing instead on the new wealth he had acquired. His accounts were full, the money flowing in from every direction. But despite the surface-level celebrations, a gnawing fear continued to eat at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It started with small signs, unfamiliar faces in the neighborhood, an unusual number of cars passing by his building. He brushed it off at first, telling himself it was just paranoia, the result of his own growing anxiety. But as the days went on, the feeling intensified. It was like someone was watching him. One afternoon, Fundz LORD sat at his desk, reviewing his financials. The numbers in front of him were absurd, millions of dollars, money he had only dreamed of just a few months ago. He had everything he wanted: cars, a luxurious home, designer clothes, women at his beck and call. But it was all starting to feel hollow. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The past few weeks had been a blur. Pulling off scams, managing accounts, and constantly moving money from one place to another. But now he was starting to feel the weight of his actions, the consequences that were lurking just around the corner. And then it came, the phone call. It was Caleb. "You need to lay low," Caleb said, his voice tight, urgent. "I've been hearing things. The FBI's gotten involved." Fundz LORD's heart dropped. He had heard rumors of law enforcement getting closer, but hearing it from Caleb made it real. The FBI wasn't just investigating a small-time scam operation anymore. They were going after the entire network, and Fundz LORD was at the center of it. "The heat's too much," Caleb continued. "The walls are closing in. You've got to get out of Benin. Now." Fundz LORD hung up the phone without saying a word. He stared at the blank screen in front of him, his thoughts racing. This was it, the moment everything fell apart. The game he had played, the empire he had built, was crumbling. The days blurred into each other as Fundz LORD tried to manage his growing panic. He reached out to his U.S. partners, but Caleb's messages were becoming less frequent, and the responses were short, cryptic. He couldn't reach anyone else in the network. He was on his own. The tension in the air was suffocating. He tried to keep a calm exterior, but inside he was a mess. Every time he stepped outside, he felt eyes on him. The police were closing in. His partners in the U.S. had been caught, and now the FBI was beginning to connect the dots, tracing the stolen money back to him. Fundz LORD had spent his entire life running from the truth, but now there was nowhere left to hide. One night, after another round of unsuccessful attempts to reach Caleb, Fundz LORD sat on the edge of his bed, his mind spinning. He thought of Amara, of the sacrifices he had made to get to this point. He thought of his mother, who had always believed in him, and how he had let her down. All of it, the wealth, the power, the scams, had come at a cost. But none of it had brought him peace. None of it had filled the emptiness inside. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at his door. Fundz LORD froze, his heart racing. His body tensed as he looked toward the door, unsure if it was his mind playing tricks on him. Another knock, louder this time. His thoughts raced. Was it the police? The FBI? He stood up quickly, his hands shaking. He walked over to the window and peered out. Below, a black SUV was parked outside, its tinted windows hiding the faces of whoever was inside. His heart sank. He knew exactly what this meant. It wasn't just a matter of hiding money anymore. The game had changed. The FBI was no longer an abstract threat. They were at his door. The door crashed open, the sound of breaking would echoing through the apartment. Before Fundz LORD could react, two officers rushed in, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the room. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. Fundz LORD's mind went blank. He knew he was caught. It was all over. But his instincts kicked in, and he bolted for the back door. He dashed through the hallway and out into the alley behind his penthouse. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran, adrenaline pushing him forward, but his mind was a blur. He had been prepared for this. He had always known that one day, the law would catch up to him. But now, when the moment finally arrived, he couldn't escape. His once untouchable empire was falling apart, and all he had was the cold night air and the distant sound of sirens growing louder behind him. He turned a corner and ran down an alley, desperate to escape the inevitable. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know how to outrun the authorities closing in on him. But he couldn't stop. It was only a matter of time before the FBI traced him down. The man who had built an empire on deception, on lies, on fraud, was now on the run. The investigation into Fundz LORD's activities had been unfolding for months, and now it was finally catching up to him. His phone buzzed again, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. It was Caleb. The messages were coming too late. The authorities had already moved in. His empire, built on a foundation of stolen money and broken lives, had crumbled in one night. The cold night air hit Fundz LORD's lungs as he ran through the maze of alleyways, each step echoing in the quiet, empty streets of Benin City. His heart hammered in his chest, a constant reminder of the mess he had created. Sweat dripped down his forehead despite the cool breeze, the terror of being hunted now real and tangible. He had thought he could outrun it. He thought the money, the power, and the connections would be enough to keep him safe. But now, standing on the edge of his empire, it all seemed pointless. The feds were closing in, and even worse, someone from his inner circle had betrayed him. The phone buzzing in his pocket broke through his frantic thoughts. He hesitated before pulling it out. He knew who it was, Caleb. His last hope, or so he thought. The message on the screen sent a shiver through his spine. "They're coming for us." Someone tipped them off. "It's over." His stomach dropped. A betrayal, but who? Who in the circle had turned on him? Fundz LORD paused at the edge of the street, crouching behind a crumbling wall, his mind racing through the possibilities. He had always been careful, always made sure to keep the operation tight, to trust only those who could be trusted. Caleb was one of the original partners. He had been with him from the start, guiding him, showing him the ropes. But now, Caleb's words didn't feel like the warning of a concerned friend. They felt like the confession of someone who was already preparing for his own escape. The betrayal had been coming. Fundz LORD had felt the cracks forming, the tension in the air. Caleb had been acting strange in the past few weeks, not returning calls, sending cryptic messages. But Fundz LORD had pushed the doubts aside, focusing on the wealth, the power, the high life he had built. Now the pieces were falling into place. Caleb had made a deal with the feds, or at least he had tipped them off. There was no other explanation. The FBI's investigation into the syndicate had intensified recently, and it had all led to Fundz LORD. But someone had spilled the details. Someone who knew the inner workings of the operation, the movements, the money laundering routes, the victims. Fundz LORD cursed under his breath. It was too late to fix it now. The feds were coming for him, and the walls were closing in. As the hours ticked by, Fundz LORD found himself in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. The plan had been to lay low, get out of town, and head to the border. But after Caleb's message, everything seemed uncertain. Trust was a fragile thing in the world Fundz LORD had built, and now, he was realizing just how much of it had been a lie. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He pulled up Caleb's contact and stared at the screen. A knot tightened in his chest. The same person who had been his mentor was now his greatest threat. With a steadying breath, he dialed. It rang for what felt like eternity. Then, on the third ring, Caleb's voice crackled through the line. "Fundz, you should have known better," Caleb said, his tone cold, almost detached. "I tried to warn you. You went too far." "What do you mean?" Fundz LORD growled, trying to keep his voice steady. But the panic rising in his chest made it hard to mask his anger. "I told you to lay low. You didn't listen. And now the feds are on their way." "We've been compromised," Caleb replied, his voice betraying no emotion. "I made sure to get myself out while I still could." "You sold me out?" Fundz LORD spat, the betrayal cutting through him like a knife. "You were supposed to be my partner. We built this empire together. Empresses fall when the king is weak," Caleb replied cryptically. "I didn't sign up for the mess you've made, Fundz. I'm done." With that, the line went dead. Sitting in the dimly lit motel room, Fundz LORD was paralyzed by the weight of Caleb's betrayal. His head spun with disbelief, anger, and frustration. The man he had trusted had sold him out to save himself, leaving Fundz LORD to face the consequences alone. But that wasn't the worst of it. Caleb's words stung, but they weren't as devastating as what came next. The realization that his entire network was crumbling. Fundz LORD had no backup plan. He had trusted too many people and thought too highly of the system they had built. In his arrogance, he had believed he was untouchable. But now, it seemed like the law was moving in on him faster than he could escape. As the hours ticked by, the silence in the motel room grew suffocating. The city outside felt like another world. He could hear the distant wail of sirens, a constant reminder that he wasn't safe. But it wasn't just Caleb. As Fundz LORD paced the small room, trying to make sense of the mess, his mind raced back to other moments in his life. The first scam he had pulled off, the first woman he had betrayed, the first sacrifice he had made. He thought of Amara, the woman he had once loved. He thought of his mother, who had always believed in him, even when everyone else turned their back. But now there was no one left. Everyone had either betrayed him or walked away, and the silence was deafening. His thoughts turned to Chijioke, the man who had brought him into this world. Was he next? Would Chijioke turn on him as well? Fundz LORD wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. Everyone had their price, and he had learned that lesson the hard way. But he couldn't think about that now. He needed to escape. He needed to get out of Benin, disappear before the authorities came for him. But as he gathered his things, preparing to leave the motel, there was a sudden knock at the door. Fundz LORD froze. His heart skipped a beat. He was no longer in control, and this time there was nowhere left to run. The knock at the door echoed in the dimly lit room, sending a wave of panic through Fundz LORD. His pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, everything went still. His mind raced. Was it the authorities? Had Caleb tipped them off after all? He had thought he could escape, vanish into the night like so many others who had walked this dangerous path before him. But now, as the world came crashing down around him, Fundz LORD realized he had miscalculated. There was no escaping the mess he had created. His hand hovered over the door handle, but before he could make a move, the door burst open. FBI! Hands in the air! 2 agents stormed into the room, their weapons trained on him. Fundz LORD's breath hitched as he slowly raised his hands. His eyes darted around the small motel room, searching for any way out, but there was no escape. They had him cornered. The agents didn't waste time. One moved forward and cuffed him with swift precision, while the other scanned the room, his eyes flicking over the scattered documents and his laptop on the table. "You've been under investigation for months, Fundz LORD," the agent who had cuffed him said, his voice flat and professional. "You've been running a multi-state fraud operation with international ties. It ends tonight." Fundz LORD said nothing. His mind raced. He had never thought it would end this way. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he was untouchable. But now, as the reality of the situation sank in, he knew the game was over. They led him out of the motel room, down the hallway, and into a waiting van. The cold night air hit him as they shoved him into the back, his thoughts spinning. As the van made its way toward the nearest federal facility, Fundz LORD's thoughts were consumed by the past. His rise had been swift, his empire built on lies, manipulation, and betrayal. But as the lights of the city receded in the distance, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had fallen. Had it been worth it? Was the money, the power, the thrill of the scam really worth the price he had paid? He thought of Amara, her face forever burned into his memory. He thought of his mother, the woman who had loved him unconditionally, even when he had turned his back on everything she had taught him. None of it mattered anymore. The empire he had built was gone. His partners had betrayed him, and now the law had caught up with him. There was no escaping his past. Fundz LORD leaned back against the cold metal of the van's interior, his mind flooded with regret. He had been so sure that he was in control, that nothing could touch him. But now it was clear. He was just another criminal being carted off to face the consequences of his actions. As the van sped through the streets, Fundz LORD tried to steady his breathing. His body felt numb, and his thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt and disbelief. He had been one step ahead for so long, but now the FBI had finally caught up with him. The truth had always been right there, waiting to be uncovered. But what really haunted him wasn't the agents who had taken him into custody. It was the life he had lived, the millions of dollars, the manipulation, the lies, the countless lives he had ruined. The FBI agent sitting across from him turned on the van's interior light, casting a harsh glow across Fundz LORD's face. "You're looking at some serious charges," the agent said, his voice detached. "Wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft. You've been running a scam operation that spans multiple countries, targeting people all over the world. We've got evidence that links you to victims across the US, Canada, and Europe." Fundz LORD's stomach turned. He had known it was coming, but hearing the truth out loud made it all the more real. The lives he had destroyed, the people who had trusted him, the families who had been swindled out of their hard-earned money, were now part of the case against him. He would be remembered as the face of one of the most elaborate and destructive fraud rings the authorities had ever seen. The agent continued, "We've also got a trail that leads back to your partners in the US. We know you were working with people who helped you move the money overseas. We're already in the process of arresting them." The words hit Fundz LORD like a punch to the gut. His partners, the people he had trusted, people like Caleb, were being arrested too. The web he had woven was unraveling, and there was no stopping it now. When they finally arrived at the facility, Fundz LORD was processed quickly, his fingerprints taken, his personal belongings confiscated. As they led him down the stark, sterile hallways of the detention center, he couldn't help but think about the life he had left behind. His penthouse, his cars, his wealth, they were all gone. And for what? A series of bad decisions. A string of lies. He had sacrificed everything for something that could never satisfy him. But there was no turning back now. He was caught, and the FBI had the evidence to put him away for a long time. They placed him in a small, cold cell, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering above him. The door slammed shut, and the sound echoed in the emptiness. Fundz LORD stood there, staring at the concrete walls, his mind racing with thoughts of what had led him to this moment. He had thought he could outsmart the system, that his power and his wealth would protect him. But in the end, the only thing that had truly protected him was the illusion of invincibility. And now the truth had caught up with him. The days bled into one another in the cold confines of the federal detention center. Time felt like a distant concept for Fundz LORD. Each day was the same, a monotonous blur of harsh lights, sterile walls, and the constant hum of the facility. The world outside seemed to have forgotten about him. He had once been at the center of a criminal empire, untouchable, commanding respect, and feared by many. Now, he was just another name on a cell door, another number in the system. The FBI had built an airtight case against him. The evidence was overwhelming. Wire transfers, bank statements, fake identities. His entire criminal operation had been laid bare. They had the U.S. partners in custody, and soon the people in Nigeria who had worked with him would be arrested too. Fundz LORD had made his choices, and now the consequences had arrived. One afternoon, after several days of solitude in his cell, Fundz LORD was summoned for a meeting. The door to his cell opened, and two officers stood there, their faces unreadable. "Fundz LORD, you've got a visitor," one of the officers said. A visitor? The words didn't make sense at first. Who could possibly want to see him now? He had no friends left. The ones who mattered had either betrayed him or turned their backs. He followed the officers down the narrow hallways of the detention center, his steps heavy with the weight of regret. They reached a small, unremarkable room, and inside, sitting at the table, was a familiar face. Chijioke. Fundz LORD's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen Chijioke in weeks, and after Caleb's betrayal, he hadn't expected anyone from his past to show up. But there Chijioke was, sitting across from him, his expression unreadable. his face older and more worn than Fundz LORD remembered. "What the hell are you doing here?" Fundz LORD asked, his voice hoarse from days of silence. Chijiok didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked Fundz LORD up and down, his gaze cold but filled with something else. Something that resembled pity. "I came to see how the mighty have fallen," Chijiok said, his voice laced with a bitter edge. "You thought you were untouchable, Fundz. You thought this game was yours to control." Fundz LORD clenched his fists, his anger rising, but he knew he couldn't afford to lash out now. "So, you came to gloat? Is that it?" Fundz LORD spat. Chijiok shook his head, his lips curling into a small, almost sad smile. "No, I came because I'm the one who made sure you were caught. You think Caleb was the only one who turned on you? You're the one who pulled the trigger on your own downfall." Fundz LORD's mind raced. "What do you mean? You told me to lay low. You told me everything would be fine." Chijiok's laugh was cold and bitter. "I told you to lay low because I knew what was coming. I knew this couldn't last forever. But you—" He paused, his gaze hardening. "You wanted it all. You were too greedy. You wanted to be the king of this world. And now look where you are." The words stung. Fundz LORD wanted to argue, to tell Chijiok that it wasn't his fault, that he had done everything he could to stay ahead. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had become too arrogant, too confident in his own abilities. He had thought he could outsmart the system forever. But now here he was trapped with no way out. As Chijiok stood up to leave, Fundz LORD felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over him. It wasn't the physical fatigue that weighed on him, but the mental toll. The constant running, the lies, the betrayals. It had all led to this moment. "You're right," Fundz LORD said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I was too greedy." Chijiok paused at the door, his back to Fundz LORD. "It's too late for regrets now. You made your choices and now you'll pay the price. The law will deal with you." Fundz LORD closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words sink in. His life had been a series of choices, each one leading him down a path that seemed more and more inevitable. He had started with nothing, but his hunger for more had consumed him. Now everything was lost. Chijiok left without another word, and Fundz LORD was alone again. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had sacrificed everything for wealth and power. He had betrayed the people who cared about him, and in the end, it hadn't been enough. He had destroyed his own life. As the days passed, the weight of his situation began to sink in. Fundz LORD sat alone in his cell, the silence almost suffocating. He had always been the one who controlled everything, the one who called the shots. But now he had no control, no power, no empire. His phone calls were monitored. His visitors were few. His fate was in the hands of the law now, and all he could do was wait for the trial to begin. But as he sat in the darkness, a small part of him wondered, was there a way out? Could he still change? Could he redeem himself? The thought seemed impossible. He had burned too many bridges, betrayed too many people. But maybe, just maybe, there was a flicker of hope, a chance to rebuild, a chance to make things right. But for now, he was trapped in the aftermath of his choices, a man who had everything and lost it all. And as the final days of his freedom slipped away, Fundz LORD knew one thing for certain. There would be no escape from the consequences of his actions.